The week before my wedding, my mother asked me to sit with her at the kitchen table. It was early, the stove still holding the last warmth from breakfast, my sisters sent outside, the house carrying a stillness it almost never had. I remember the particular quality of that quiet and what I believed it meant. I thought, this is the moment. This is when she tells me what I need to know. She folded her hands on the table and looked at me directly, and what she said was this: a wife submits to her husband. That is what God asks of you. That is all you need to know. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her apron, and returned to the dishes. The conversation had lasted less than a minute. Those 7 words were my entire preparation for the most disorienting night of my life. I was 19 years old. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because this is not one woman's unusual experience. It is not an edge case or an exception. What I am about to describe is what virtually every Amish girl I grew up alongside received before her wedding night. Some received a few words more. Most received less. And the effects of that silence did not stay in the bedroom. They moved forward through years of marriage, into ordinary mornings at kitchen tables, into the quiet space between 2 people who had promised their lives to each other and could not find words for the loneliness that had taken up residence underneath the routine. This is that story. Looking back from where I stand now, having sat with therapists and turned these years over, the way you turn over something that has been sitting in the same place so long the ground has shaped itself around it, I keep arriving at the same understanding. There were 3 things we were taught about men and marriage. 3 things the community considered sufficient. And not one of them was true in the way we actually needed it to be. The first was this: men have needs, and meeting those needs is a wife's duty. This was never announced plainly. Nothing in Amish life is plain-spoken when it touches the body. Instead, it was threaded through everything, present in every sermon about submission, embedded in the way older women spoke about their husbands, with a kind of patient resignation I mistook, when I was young, for a form of peace. It was in the passage from Ephesians read aloud at every wedding I attended from childhood onward. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. The message never varied. The husband leads. The wife yields. Whatever he requires, she provides. Whether she had needs of her own, whether those needs were real or legitimate, was simply not a question the community held space for. A few days before my wedding, my aunt pulled me aside. She was a woman I genuinely loved, warm and capable, someone I had watched raise 7 children and hold a household together with a kind of unhurried steadiness that made it look almost effortless, even though I understood even then that it wasn't. If anyone was going to say something true and useful to me, I thought it would be her. She had lived it. She knew things. She took my hands in hers and looked at me with great seriousness and said, "Be patient with him. Men are not complicated. They only need to feel respected." I nodded as though I understood. I did not understand. I had no idea what respect had to do with the specific thing I was afraid of. I didn't even have words for what I was afraid of. But I thanked her, and she embraced me, and the moment was over. That was the closest anyone who loved me came to preparing me. Be patient. Men need respect. That was the first lesson. The second is harder to explain, but it may have done more lasting damage. We were taught that intimacy within marriage was sacred precisely because it was never spoken. Modesty in the old order world is not only about clothing, not only about keeping your hair covered and your hem to the right length. Modesty is something you carry inside your own thinking. You do not linger on your body. You do not examine your own desires. You do not speak about physical things, because giving them language makes them present in a way the community considered dangerous. I grew up understanding that a virtuous woman did not allow herself to dwell on the wedding night, that dwelling on it was already a kind of immodesty, that the girls who whispered about such things at Sunday singings were moving toward something shameful. So I did not let myself think about it, or I tried not to. And when the thoughts arrived anyway, the fear, the questions, the vast blankness where actual information should have been, I pushed them under and told myself that God would provide understanding when the time came. That was how these things were communicated, in language vague enough to mean almost nothing. God will guide you. Trust your husband. The body knows. I have returned to those last 3 words many times since leaving. In one sense, yes, the body knows things. It knows cold and hunger and exhaustion. It knows touch. But a body that has been given no real information, that has been trained since girlhood to treat its own signals with suspicion, that has been taught to associate physical self-awareness with sinfulness, that body is not a trustworthy guide. That body has been quietly and consistently turned against itself, and no one told us that. No one told us we might arrive at our wedding night frightened of our own skin. The third thing we were taught about men was perhaps the quietest and most corrosive of all. We were taught that a husband's patience was a grace extended to his wife, and that a good wife did not put that patience at risk. What that meant in practice was this: if something felt wrong, if there was pain or confusion or discomfort, the correct response was silence. Endurance. A good wife did not make her husband feel he had caused harm. A good wife absorbed whatever the wedding night brought and moved forward from it, without asking questions or naming what she had experienced. My friend Rebecca married at 20. She was one of the most genuinely gentle people I have known, the kind of woman who carried other people's dates and sorrows in her memory without effort, who laughed openly in a community where open laughter was rare. She told me, years after we had both left, what her wedding night had been like. She said the hardest part was not the pain, and not the confusion, and not even the strangeness of lying in an unfamiliar room, feeling like someone who had just met her own body for the first time. The hardest part was that her husband, a good man, a man who had no intention of causing her distress, fell asleep afterward, and she lay there in the dark with no framework at all for what had just happened. She did not know whether it was supposed to feel the way it had felt. She did not know if she had done something incorrectly. She did not know whether what she was feeling was grief or guilt or simply what marriage was. She lay there staring at the ceiling until nearly dawn, and in the morning she made breakfast and said nothing, because that was the third lesson. A good wife endures. A good wife's silence is her faithfulness. Rebecca carried that silence for 8 months before an older woman in her church district said something to her. Not directly, it was never direct, but sideways, in the careful language Amish women use to pass knowledge that had no official channel. A remark about olive oil. A glance held a fraction of a second longer than necessary. A door opened just enough to walk through. 8 months, because no one had told her there was a door. I was married on a Thursday in late October. The wedding was held at my parents' home, nearly 300 people filling the house and the barn, tables loaded with food that had taken days to prepare. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes rich with butter, pies arranged along the counter, in a long, careful row. The house held the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular warmth that comes from people who love each other gathered into one space. The ceremony was long. The bishop preached about yielding, about the correct foundation for a household, about what God requires of a husband and a wife. I sat in my plain blue dress and white apron, and I listened, and underneath all the listening I kept turning over the conversation at the kitchen table. 7 words. A wife submits to her husband. That is all you need to know. By the time Jonas and I were finally alone that night, I had been awake for nearly 20 hours. My feet ached through to the bones. My face had gone stiff from holding a smile all day. The bedroom was plain and quiet. A wooden bed Jonas had built himself. A quilt my grandmother had pieced in blue and cream squares. A basin of cool water on the dresser. A kerosene lamp burning low on the nightstand and throwing long, slow shadows up the walls. Jonas sat on the edge of the bed and loosened his collar. We looked at each other. And in that moment, I understood that we were both equally frightened. He had received the same preparation I had, a conversation with his father that, as he told me much later, had consisted of work hard, lead well, provide for your family. Nothing about the room we were now sitting in together. Nothing about the girl across from him who was trying to keep her hands still. We were two people who had been given a life together and sent into a room with no map and the unspoken expectation that we would find our way. What happened that night was not terrible. Jonas was careful in the manner of someone genuinely trying to avoid harm, but with no knowledge of what harm might look like in practice. There was discomfort I had not expected. There were moments when I wanted to ask questions and could not find the words. There were moments when I wanted to say, "Wait," and did not know whether I was permitted to, because what I had been taught was a wife submits. A wife does not test patience. The body knows. My body did not know. My body was full of questions that no one had ever thought to answer. Afterward, Jonas held me in the dark and asked if I was all right. I said yes. It was not entirely untrue. I was all right in the sense that I was still present, still breathing, still whole. But I was also all right in the way you say it, when you have no vocabulary for what you actually are. When the only language you were ever given was silence and endurance and submission. And none of those words means all right, but none of them means the opposite either. We lay there with the lamp burning low, the sounds of the farm coming through the window, horses settling, wind moving through the fields, the ordinary world continuing exactly as it had before, indifferent to everything that had just shifted inside that room. I did not sleep for a long time. In the months after I left the community, after the shunning had settled into its particular quiet, letters returned without being opened, phone calls that rang and rang until the silence on the other end became its own kind of answer. I found a therapist, an Englishwoman with a small office full of plants and a patience that seemed to have no boundary. In one of our early sessions, I described my wedding night, not dramatically, just carefully, the way you describe something you have never put into language before, testing each sentence to see whether it holds the actual weight of what you mean. She listened without interruption. She did not flinch. She did not look at me with the particular pity that makes what you are describing feel worse than it already is. She simply listened. When I finished, she said something I have not forgotten. She said, "You weren't unprepared because no one cared about you. You were unprepared because the system needed you to be." I held that for a long time. I turned it over the way you turn something that is heavier than it appears. Because she was right. An Amish bride who knows her own body, who has language for her own experience, who understands that her comfort is real and her pain is not a spiritual assignment. That woman is harder to keep quiet. That woman asks questions. That woman might say, "Wait," or "I need more time," or "This doesn't feel right." And a woman who says those things is a woman the system cannot fully hold. The silence was never just modesty. The silence was structural. It was load-bearing. It held everything else in place. And it had been transmitted so carefully, so consistently, across so many generations of women teaching their daughters exactly what they themselves had been taught, that no one along the entire length of that chain had ever stopped to ask whether it was kind, whether it was honest, whether it bore any resemblance to what love was actually supposed to look like. I want to say one more thing before I close. I do not tell this story to leave you with anger toward the Amish community. The community gave me things I have not put down and will not. A relationship to work that has carried me through every hard year since I left. A sense of belonging so deep, it had a physical texture. A faith that has been broken and questioned and rebuilt, but that remains real to me. I do not want to erase any of that. But I tell this story because I know that what happened to me and to Rebecca, and to every girl I grew up with, did not only happen in Lancaster County. There are girls right now in other communities, other traditions, other families, being handed silence and told that silence is holiness. Being given one brief conversation at a kitchen table, or no conversation at all, and sent forward into marriages and beds and lives they have no real language for. Who will lie awake in unfamiliar rooms asking questions they were never given permission to ask? And I want those women to hear what no one said to me on that October morning. Your body is not a thing to be feared or kept mysterious from yourself. It belongs to you. You are allowed to know it. You are allowed to have questions. You are allowed to say this doesn't feel right, and I need more time and wait, and not yet. Those words are not sin. They are not immodesty. They are not evidence of failed faith or failed submission or failed love. They are the most fundamental thing any person is owed. I was 19 years old when I sat across from my husband in a room lit by a single lamp and had no words for what I needed. I am not 19 anymore. And I will keep speaking for as long as I need to, in a place where anyone who needs these words can find them. Because the silence was never sacred. It was only silence. If this reached something in you, leave your words below. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me your story, if you're ready to tell it. You are not nearly as alone as the silence taught you to believe. There is still so much that hasn't been said. Until then, know this. Your voice was always yours. Even during all the years they taught you to swallow it. What you do with it from here is yours to decide. And that decision is worth everything.